Sit on your couch in the hollow of a conversation where the silence has stopped being comfortable, and notice that vague but insistent dread, the sense that something is missing. You still reach for a word, or it will reach for you in the counselor's office, in the self-help aisle, in the quiet aftermath of what do you actually want. That word is purpose. And yet, for all its ubiquity, I would argue that it is one of the least carefully examined concepts in the popular discourse of human flourishing. We invoke it constantly, fervently even, and yet rarely do we stop to ask what we actually mean by it, and more importantly, whether what we mean by it is even coherent. So let us do that now. Let us try to be precise, which I appreciate is somewhat antithetical to the spirit of this content on this topic. But I think the precision is necessary, because if we are genuinely grappling with the question of what it means to live a purposeful life, or what it means to lose that sense of purpose entirely, then we owe it to ourselves to understand what we are talking about. One thing before we start. I'm not a psychologist, a philosopher, or any kind of specialist in any related field. These are personal reflections, not professional counsel. They should be received as such, with interest perhaps, but also with a healthy degree of skepticism. The first thing worth establishing is that purpose is not a simple goal. A goal is a discrete target, something achievable and crucially exhaustible. You can finish a goal. You can tick it off a list, and in doing so, render it inert. Purpose, by contrast, is not exhaustible in the same way. It is better understood as a kind of directional orientation, a vector, if you will, that organizes and gives coherence to various goals, projects, and commitments that constitute life. As Viktor Frankl put it, where you have a why, you can bear anyhow. Or, in other words, it is the why behind the what. And unlike a goal, it does not terminate upon completion. If anything, achieving goals in itself tends to deepen it. Nor is purpose the same thing as passion, though the two are frequently conflated, often in ways that I find somewhat repellent in their superficiality. Passion is an emotional state, volatile, idiosyncratic, and notoriously poor as a long-term compass. We are told with nauseating regularity to follow our passion, as though passion was some stable inner flow, patiently awaiting discovery rather than a fluctuating affective response that waxes and wanes with circumstance, health, and mood. Purpose, by contrast, can persist through the relative absence of passion. The relationship between purpose and positive feeling is far more complicated than the motivational poster would have you believe. And then there is meaning, which is, I would suggest, the closest conceptual neighbor to purpose, but still a slightly different animal. Meaning tends to be retrospective. It is what we impose upon experience in the act of narrating our lives to ourselves and others. Purpose, on the other hand, is perspective. It is forward-facing, a horizon that organizes present action. You can, and people often do, experience a life as deeply meaningful in retrospect, but having lived it in a state of considerable purposelessness in the moment. The two can come apart, and recognizing that they can come apart is, I think, genuinely important. I have been circling a lot around the question of whether purpose is something you discover or something you construct. The discovery model is probably the more culturally dominant one. It posits that something latent within you is waiting to be excavated in the dusk of life that would strip away the noise until you arrive at what was always there. In the same day that Michelangelo allegedly did not carve a sculpture so much as reveal one, removing everything from the marble that wasn't it. There is something obviously appealing about this picture, but the empirical record of purposeful lives does not, in general, look like excavation. It looks more like accretion. Purpose tends to emerge from sustained engagement, from competence built incrementally, from commitment that gradually coalesces into something that begins to feel irreplaceable. Purpose is not found, the constructivist would argue. It is made. And there is something important in that framing because it implies a degree of volition that the discovery model tends to obscure. Finally, and this is arguably the most underappreciated distinction of all, there is a difference between having a purpose and feeling purposeful. These two states are regularly treated as synonymous, but they are not. It is entirely possible to have a purpose that is coherent and legitimate while feeling in your daily experience almost entirely adrift. The feeling of purposefulness is a phenomenological state. Having a purpose is something more structural, more dispositional. The separation is necessary here because it tells us where to look when things go wrong, whether your purpose has genuinely collapsed or whether something has merely interrupted your capacity to feel it. As we'll see, those are very different problems with different implications. Put a pin in that last distinction because we are going to need it further on. I want to ask you something, and I'd like you to sit with it rather than answer too quickly. Can you remember the last time you woke up and already knew before your feet hit the floor why the day mattered? Not in some grand cosmic sense, just the ordinary functional sense of feeling oriented. Because I think most people, if they are honest, cannot pinpoint the moment that feeling left. And that, I argue, is one of the most insidious things about losing purpose. It rarely announces itself. It doesn't arrive like a diagnosis or a breakup with a clear before and after. It tends to drain away slowly, the way light does in the late afternoon, gradually, then all at once, and you only notice when the room is already dim. There are, broadly speaking, two modes by which purpose disappears. The first is the slow fade, which is probably the more common of the two. This is the person who has been doing the same work, inhabiting the same life, for long enough that what once felt like a calling has begun to feel like a commute. The meaning hasn't been violently extracted. It's simply been worn down by repetition, by accumulated compromise, by the thousand small disillusionments that don't individually register as significant, but that compound quietly into something that does. You don't decide to stop caring. You just notice one day that you haven't for a while. The second mode is sharper and, in some ways, stranger. It is the sudden collapse, often triggered not by failure but its opposite. There is a particular kind of person, and I suspect some of you will recognize this, who spends years in fervent pursuit of a goal, reaches it, and finds that the arrival feels almost repugnant in its emptiness. The promotion, the degree, the relationship, the number on the screen. You got the thing, and the thing, it turns out, was mostly load-bearing scaffolding for a sense of purpose you had mistaken for the purpose itself. When the scaffolding comes down, so does everything it was holding up. Burnout belongs in this category, though it is often misdiagnosed as a productivity problem, a matter of rest deficits and poor boundary setting, when it is at its core a meaning problem. The person who is merely exhausted wants rest and then wants to return. The person in genuine burnout doesn't want to return. The exhaustion is almost incidental. What's actually being depleted is the felt sense that the effort is for something. Rest alone cannot replenish what rest was never responsible for sustaining. What follows the disappearance, regardless of how it happened, tends to look from the outside like low mood or laziness, and from the inside like something considerably harder to name. Anhedonia is the clinical term, the flattening of affect, the absence of anticipation, the way that things which once generated genuine feeling begin to register as merely neutral. You go through the motions not because you are deceiving anyone, but because the motions are all that remain, and they provide at least an outline of a life, even when the interior has gone quiet. Nel mezzo del cammin di nostra vita mi ritrovai per una selva oscura, che la dirita via era smarrita. This is a line from Dante that I keep returning to in this context, and it means, in the middle of the journey of our life, I came to myself in a dark wood, for the straight way was lost. And what strikes me about it is not the drama of the darkness, but the passivity of the arrival. He did not go to the dark wood, he simply found himself there, in the middle of his life, having apparently lost the path without noticing he has strayed from it. This is, I think, a more honest portrait of how purpose disappears than anything that the self-help industry has to offer. It is less a dramatic rupture and more a quiet subtraction. And the cruelty of it is that by the time most people recognize what has happened, they are already too far inside the absence to clearly remember what they've lost. Who are you exactly when you are not doing anything? Not in the sense of an idle Tuesday afternoon, but in a deeper sense, when the role is gone and the project has ended, when the thing around which you organize your sense of self has been removed. I ask because I think most of us, if pressed, would discover that the answer is considerably less stable than we have assumed. We tend to experience ourselves as having an identity that we then express through our pursuits. But I want to suggest the arrow of causation frequently runs the other way. We construct a self out of our pursuits, and the self is, in many cases, far more contingent on those pursuits than we are comfortable admitting. There is a mundane but surprisingly precise analogy to how this works. You are not in any meaningful sense aware of your toes until you walk them into the corner of a piece of furniture, and then, suddenly, you are aware of very little else. Pain has a way of collapsing attention onto whatever it is that hurts, and in doing so, it reveals that the thing existed all along, quietly, without requiring your acknowledgement. Identity operates by something like the same mechanism. For most of us, for most of our early life, the self is simply the medium through which experience occurs. Transparent, unremarked upon, no more visible than the air in a room you have always lived in. It is only when something begins to hurt, when the first serious failure arrives, or the first loss, or the first genuine confrontation with the question of what you actually are, beneath the roles you have been performing, that the self becomes an object rather than just a subject. Albert Camus located this moment precisely. It is the encounter with the absurd, the collision between our hunger for meaning and the universe's absolute refusal to provide one, that transforms a person from a creature who simply lives into one who must reckon with the fact of their living. Before that collision, the question of identity is largely academic. After it, it is rarely anything else. This is not a new observation. The psychoanalyst Erik Erikson spent much of his career mapping the relationship between identity and what he called purposeful activity. The idea that coherent sense of self is not something that we are simply handed at birth, fully formed, but something that requires ongoing maintenance, a continuous act of authorship. The novelist in you will recognize this. A character without a want is not a character at all. They are furniture. And we are, in this respect, not so different from characters. We require a narrative, a sense of direction within the story, in order to feel like someone rather than just something that exists. Purpose is, among other things, the plot of the self, which means that when purpose dissolves, what is often experienced as an emotional crisis is also simultaneously an ontological one. It is not merely that you feel bad. It is that the structure through which you understand yourself to be a particular kind of person have become unreliable. The lawyer who spent 15 years building an identity around law and who one day finds that work has become hollow. She is not simply dissatisfied with her job. She is, in a very real sense, grappling with the question of whether she still knows who she is. I had the unfortunate chance to speak to a couple of people in precisely this situation. And what strikes me consistently is that the grief they describe is not quite the grief of loss in the conventional sense. It is more disorienting than that. It is the grief of looking in the mirror and finding that the reflection is unfamiliar. The ego, and I'm using the term loosely in the broadly psychological rather than strictly Freudian sense, has a profound need for narrative coherence. It needs the story of your life to hang together, to have an internal logic or legible arc. Purpose provides exactly that. It is the through line that makes the individual chapters feel like they belong to the same book. When it goes, the chapters remain, but they begin to feel arbitrary. The years you spent, the choices you made, the sacrifices that seemed at the time like investments, all of it starts to look less like a coherent project and more like a sequence of events that happened to the same person. And that reprisal can be genuinely destabilizing in a way that is difficult to convey to someone who hasn't experienced it. It is not melodrama. It is the entirely rational consequence of having built something on a foundation that has since crumbled. And what remains then? This is the question I find most interesting and most uncomfortable. Because there is a view, and it has serious philosophical backing from the Buddhists to David Hume to certain strains of contemporary cognitive science, that what remains when you strip away the roles, the projects, the narrative scaffolding, is not a stable, essential self waiting quietly underneath. It is rather something considerably more fluid and provisional. A set of dispositions, inclinations, relational patterns, the uncomfortable implication being that the self you were so anxious to lose was, in some meaningful sense, always more constructed than it felt. That the solidity was partly innate and partly, perhaps largely, on loan from the purposes you have surrounded yourself with. Have you ever considered that this actually cuts both ways? If the self is partly constructed through purpose, then its dissolution is not only a loss. It may also, under the right conditions, be the precondition for something new. But we are not ready to go there yet. First, we need to look more honestly at what it actually feels like when the story collapses and why so many people describe it with striking consistency in the language of death. I want to be precise about the title of this clip because it is easy to mistake it for a hyperbole, for the kind of dramatic overstatement that gets clicks but doesn't really mean anything. When I say, and so do you, I'm not being rhetorical in the decorative sense. I am pointing at something that people who have been through a genuine collapse of purpose describe with a consistency that is frankly too striking to dismiss. They don't say they felt sad. They don't say they felt loss, exactly. They say they felt, in some fundamental way, that they had stopped existing, that the person who showed up to work, who ate dinner, who answered messages and maintained the ordinary choreography of a life was not quite them. Was a version of them, perhaps, a functional facsimile, if you want, but not a thing itself. This is what I mean by death, and I think it is worth taking the metaphor seriously rather than softening it into something more palatable. There is a concept in neuroscience and philosophy of mind called the narrative self. The idea that our sense of being a continuous, coherent person is sustained by an ongoing story we tell about ourselves, one that connects the past to the present and extends with reasonable confidence into the future. What purpose does, among other things, is anchor that narrative. It gives the story a direction, and when it is removed, what many people experience is not grief in the ordinary sense, but something closer to what the philosopher Thomas Metzinger calls a disruption of self-models, a condition in which the machinery of selfhood continues to operate, but without the felt sense of anyone home to operate it. The lights are on. Nobody is there. I find it telling that this is also more or less the clinical description of severe depersonalization, a condition that is far more common than most people realize, and that tends to emerge with noticeable frequency in the aftermath of exactly the kind of purposelessness I'm describing. The literary tradition has always known this, even when the science hadn't caught up. In the T.S. Eliot's The Hollow Man, we read, "We are the hollow man, the stuffed man, leaning together, headpiece filled with straw." And it is not a poem about sadness. It is a poem about a particular kind of living death, the condition of people who are technically animate, but existentially inert. Just the same as Tolstoy's Ivan Ilyich spends the better part of his adult life in precisely this state, performing the current life so successfully that he doesn't notice it is not his life until he is actually dying, at which point the two deaths, the metaphorical one he has always been living and the literal one now approaching, converge in a way that is almost unbearable to read. The recurrence of those across centuries and traditions suggests we are dealing with something genuinely archetypal here. This is not a modern neurosis. It is an old human problem that the modern world has simply found new and more efficient ways to produce. Now, there is an important distinction I want to draw, because I think the death metaphor, taken seriously, actually contains two quite different possibilities. The first is death as erasure, the self simply hollowing out, the narrative collapsing without resolution, the person diminishing into a kind of permanent gray. This is the darker trajectory, and it is real that we should not flinch from it. But the second possibility, and this is where it gets genuinely interesting, is death as shedding. The idea that what is dying is not the self in its entirety, but a particular version of the self, one that had become so entangled with a specific purpose that it could not survive that purpose dissolution. In mythology, this pattern is everywhere. It is the hero's descent, the dark night of the soul, the alchemical concept of nigredo, the blackening, the decomposition that precedes transformation. The question is not whether death is happening. The question is whether it is a full stop or a comma. I don't think I can answer that question for now, and I would be suspicious of anyone claiming they could. What I can say is that the answer appears to depend, at least in part, on what you do inside the absence, whether you treat it as a problem to be immediately solved, a wound to be immediately dressed, or whether you can bear to sit with it long enough to understand what it is actually telling you. That is a harder ask than it sounds. But for now, I want to move toward the thinkers who have wrestled most seriously with the philosophical dimensions of this condition. Because it turns out that the questions of whether a purposeless life is a tragedy or simply the truth has been one of the most contested and consequential debates in the history of human thought. There is a fork in the road that every person who has seriously confronted purposelessness eventually reaches, and it is this. Is the absence of inherent purpose a crisis, a deviation from how things ought to be, a problem demanding a solution, or is it simply the truth, the honest baseline condition of a universe that was never organized around human meaning in the first place? How you answer that question, or rather how you leave that question, determines almost everything about what comes next. And the history of philosophy is, in no small part, a history of people arguing fiercely about which side of that fork is the correct one. The nihilist says there is no inherent meaning, no purpose baked into the structure of things, and the sooner you accept this, the better. Nietzsche, who is routinely misread as a nihilist but was actually one of nihilism's most fervent critics, understood that the death of God, by which he meant not merely the theological claim but the broader collapse of any framework for value, would produce exactly the kind of purposelessness I'm describing. What he called passive nihilism is the condition of a person who has absorbed this truth and simply deflated under its weight, retreating into a numbness or a distraction of a kind of low-grade despair. I am part of this category. I do bury in work to exhaustion just to keep my brain busy long enough that it has no chance of straying on dark paths of what is the purpose of life and the like. It is, I think, a recognizable portrait of many. You may have met this kind of person. You may have, at certain points, have been this person. Nietzsche's proposed remedy, the active reevaluation of values, the will to create meaning rather than receiving it, is admirable in its ambition, but it asks rather a lot of people who are already struggling to get out of the bed in the morning. The existentialists took a different angle, and I find their framing considerably more useful, precisely because it begins not with a solution, but with an honest acknowledgement of the problem. Sartre's claim that existence precedes essence, that we arrive in the world without a predetermined nature or purpose, and that the self is entirely a product of what we choose and do, is either liberating or terrifying, depending on where you are standing. If you have a robust sense of agency and a stable foundation, it sounds like freedom. If you are in the middle of a purposeless episode, it sounds like being handed a black canvas in a dark room and told that the painting is entirely your responsibility. What the existentialists got right, I think, is the insistence that the purposelessness is not a pathology to be treated, but a condition to be engaged. That the discomfort of it is not a signal that something has gone wrong with you, but an invitation to take seriously the question of what you actually value when no external structure is doing the valuing for you. But it is Camus who I keep returning to, because Camus had the particular honesty to stare at the absurd, his term for the collision between the human need for meaning and the universe's complete indifference to that need, without blinking and without reaching for a comforting resolution. His image of Sisyphus, condemned to roll his boulder up the hill for eternity, only to watch it roll back down, is not intended as a portrait of futility. It is intended as a portrait of defiance. One must imagine Sisyphus happy, he writes, and the happiness he has in mind is not the happiness of someone who has found meaning, but the happiness of someone who has decided to push away, fully aware that the hill does not care, that the boulder will always return, and that none of this cancels the effort of pushing. There is something in this that I find genuinely bracing. It does not resolve the problem of purposelessness. It refuses to. But it does suggest that resolution may be the wrong thing to be looking for. The Eastern traditions arrive at a surprising adjacent place by a very different route, where the Western existentialists tend to emphasize the construction of meaning through will and choice. Buddhism suggests that the problem is not the absence of purpose, but the attachment to the need for one. The concept of ego death in the Buddhist tradition is not, it is important to note, a catastrophe. It is, at least aspirationally, a liberation. The falling away of the constructed self that was always the source of the suffering, not its solution. The purposeless void that feels from inside the Western philosophical framework like a wound is reframed here as something closer to an opening. I want to be careful not to flatten these traditions into a tidy cross-cultural agreement, because they are making quite distinct metaphysical claims. But the convergence is at least worth noting, that the self, which clings most desperately to purpose as its justification for existing, may be precisely the self that is in most need of loosening its grip. What none of these frameworks fully address, and what I think deserves its own honest reckoning, is the sheer difficulty of living inside the question. The fact that philosophical equanimity is considerably easier to articulate than to embody, and that the gap between understanding an idea and being genuinely sustained by it can be vast. Camus can tell me to imagine Sisyphus happy. This does not mean I will manage it on a grey Wednesday morning when the boulder feels particularly heavy and the hill looks particularly steep. And it's also raining, just as a sort of an icing or a cherry on top of all mockeries. Dispassionate inquiry alone is not enough to carry a person through. I want to linger a little longer in the philosophical territory because there are two thinkers I have so far conspicuously avoiding, and I think the avoidance has been a mild form of dishonesty. Camus and the existentialists, for all their unflinching qualities, ultimately propose something: defiance, construction, engagement. They are, in the end, on the side of life, even if a life stripped of easy consolations. The next two thinkers are not, and their dissent from their position is worth taking seriously rather than dismissing as mere temperamental darkness. Arthur Schopenhauer begins from a metaphysical claim that is either clarifying or devastating, depending on your disposition. And it is this: beneath the surface of all apparent purpose, all human striving, all the projects and ambitions and loves through which we organize our lives, there operates a single blind force he calls the will. Not a will in the sense of conscious intention, but a primordial, purposeless drive that animates all of existence without itself having any aim. You want things, you pursue them, you occasionally obtain them, and then, almost instantaneously, the wanting resumes, redirected at something new, because the will is not interested in your satisfaction. It is interested only in its own perpetuation. The result, Schopenhauer argues, is that human life oscillates endlessly between two poles: the suffering of unfulfilled desire and the boredom of fulfillment, with no stable ground between them. Purpose, in this framework, is not a solution to the human condition. It is a particularly elaborate expression of it, another phase of the same insatiable striving that generates suffering in the first place. I find this genuinely uncomfortable to sit with, which is probably a sign that it contains something that is worth attending to. Because there is a version of the purposelessness we have been describing that Schopenhauer's framework illuminates better than any other. The person who has achieved everything they set out to achieve and found it hollow is not, on his account, someone who chose the wrong purpose. They are someone who has caught a glimpse of the underlying mechanism, who has seen perhaps for the first time that the forward momentum of purposeful striving was always partly an engine running on its own fuel, and that the destination was never really the point. The achievement reveals the will behind the willing, and the will, seen clearly, is not a particularly comforting side. His proposed remedy, aesthetic contemplation, asceticism, the quieting of desire, has always struck me as somewhat grotesque in its bleakness. And I don't think most people are genuinely capable of it, nor that they should be. But his diagnosis is, I think, among the most honest in the tradition, and to skip past it in a conversation about purpose would be to leave the hardest questions unasked. Emil Cioran is Schopenhauer's most fervent and most personal heir, more so in this specific respect than Nietzsche, who absorbed the pessimism early and then spent the rest of his career trying to dismantle it. Nietzsche is perhaps Schopenhauer's most consequential student. Cioran is the one who never left. And he takes the same territory into considerably more lyrical, more frankly unhinged terrain. Where Schopenhauer was a systematic philosopher, Cioran wrote in aphorisms and fragments, short, devastating detonation of thought that resist the kind of sustained argument we have been tracing here, and that are perhaps more honest for it. His Trouble with Being Born book opens with the observation that it is not worth the bother of killing yourself, since you always kill yourself too late, which is either the most nihilistic sentence in modern philosophy or a very dark joke, and Cioran would probably say the distinction is unimportant. What he was mapping across his entire body of work is the condition of a person for whom the usual analgesics against purposelessness, hope, love, ambition, the consolation of philosophy itself, have all been tried and found insufficient. Not because he was deficient in his application of them, but because from where he stood, their insufficiency was simply the truth of the matter. His writing has been called, with some accuracy, a daily negotiation with the decision to continue, to put it in a YouTube algorithm-friendly manner, which is not an endorsement of self-termination, but an acknowledgement that writing for Cioran functioned as a daily negotiation of the question of whether to continue. And there is something in that formulation that I think speaks directly to what we have been calling the death that accompanies the loss of purpose. Cioran did not resolve the problem. He did not find his way through in any conventional sense. What he did was to make the condition itself into something, not a solution, but an artifact, a body of work that has outlasted him and that continues to find readers precisely because it refuses to lie about what the path of experience actually feels like. The pessimists are not wrong about everything. The will is real. The striving is often circular. The consolations are frequently inadequate. Acknowledging this is not the same as conceding to it. But you cannot honestly move through something you have not been willing to look at directly. I want to propose something that may initially sound like a deflection, but which I think is actually one of the more important reframings available to us in this monologue. When people lose their sense of purpose, the story they tend to tell themselves is a story of personal inadequacy, that something has gone wrong specifically with them, that other people are out there living with directions and vitality while they alone are lost, that this is a failure of character, of will, of some innate capacity for meaning making that they simply lack. And I understand why the story is so compelling. It is, among other things, easier to pathologize yourself than to interrogate the environment that shaped you. But I think the evidence taken seriously points somewhere considerably less comfortable than individual failing. We live inside a culture that has performed a very specific and largely unacknowledged operation on the concept of purpose. It has taken something that is, at its core, relational and existential, a question about what your life is for, in the broadest possible sense, and systematically collapsed it into a question about what you produce. The Protestant work ethic, which Max Weber mapped with remarkable precision over a century ago, planted the seed. The idea that diligent, productive labor was not merely economically useful, but morally significant, a signal of one's worth in the eyes of God, and by extension, in the eyes of everyone else. God has since, for many people, exited the picture. But the equation between productivity and worth has not. It has simply been secularized and intensified until we have arrived at the current arrangement in which a person's value is more or less legibly indexed to their output, their hustle, their personal brand, the degree to which they have converted their interior life into a marketable asset. The consequences of these arrangements are, I think, considerably more serious than they are usually treated as being. When your sense of purpose is structurally entangled with your productivity, you are not merely vulnerable to the ordinary existential fluctuations that have always been a part of human experience. You are vulnerable to the entire apparatus of late-stage capitalism, to redundancy, to automation, to the market's complete indifference to whether your particular skills happen to remain in demand. And beyond the economical dimension, you are vulnerable for something subtler and in some ways more corrosive. The condition of having outsourced the question of your own worth to an external system that was never designed to answer it and that will not notice if it breaks you in the process. This is not a hyperbole. The data on burnout, on disengagement, on what researchers are increasingly calling a meaning crisis in industrialized societies is not inconclusive. Something is genuinely wrong, and it is wrong at scale. There is a particular cruelty in the way this gets individualized. The person who cannot find purpose in their work is offered productivity hacks, journaling prompts. They are encouraged to optimize, to reframe, to practice gratitude, all which may have some marginal value and none of which address the structural conditions that produced the problem in the first place. It is, to borrow a medical analogy, the equivalent of treating the symptoms of lead poisoning while leaving the lead in the water supply. I am not suggesting that individual agency is irrelevant. We will get to that. But I am suggesting that the relentless individualization of what is essentially a collective problem serves a fairly transparent function. It keeps the scrutiny pointed inward at the person who is suffering rather than outward at the arrangements that are producing the suffering. This also explains something that might otherwise seem paradoxical. The fact that purposelessness appears to be most acute not among people who are materially deprived, but among people who are, by most external measures, doing rather well. The phenomenon is sometimes called arrival fallacy, the discovery that reaching the destination you had oriented your entire life toward does not, in fact, deliver the sense of meaning you had anticipated. Is not primarily a psychological glitch. It is the predictable outcome of having been handed a map that was never drawn to lead anywhere worth going. If the purpose you constructed was always at its foundation a purpose gratified by the culture rather than emerged from genuine self-examination, then its achievement will feel hollow, for the simple reason that it was always a performance of purpose rather than the thing itself. And the culture, it is worth noting, is not particularly invested in helping you notice the difference. A person in genuine pursuit of their own meaning is considerably harder to monetize than a person in anxious pursuit of the next external marker of worth. None of this is to say that purpose cannot be found or built with the right structure that we happen to inhabit. It clearly can. People manage it all the time, often in spite of rather than because of the incentive that surrounds them. But I think it matters practically, not just intellectually, to understand that the void you may be feeling is not evidence of your idiosyncratic failure. It is, at least in part, the entirely rational response of a person who has been asked to find deep meaning within a system that was never designed to provide it. That does not solve the problem, but it does, I hope, reframe it. The question is not simply what is wrong with me. The question is what is wrong and what can I actually do about it, which is a harder question and a more honest one, and the one I am going to spend the rest of this monologue trying to answer. I have been speaking up to this point largely in the language of the mind, of narrative selves and philosophical frameworks and structural conditions. But I want to come down from that altitude for a moment, because purposelessness is not only a cognitive or existential phenomenon. It lives in the body. And I think the body deserves its own honest chapter in this story, partly because it is so often the first place the crisis actually announces itself. long before the mind has found the words for what is happening. You probably know the feeling I'm describing, even if you have never connected it to this particular cause. It is the heaviness that greets you in the morning that is not quite tiredness. You may have slept perfectly well, but something more like resistance, a physical reluctance to re-enter the day that goes beyond anything a cup of coffee is equipped to address. It is the way that ordinary tasks, things that once required no particular effort of will, begin to demand a negotiation, like getting dressed, replying to a message, leaving the house. None of these things are difficult in any objective sense, and yet they accumulate a weight that is genuinely disproportionate to what is actually asked of you. And this is not laziness, though it is routinely mistaken for it by other people, and perhaps more damagingly by the person experiencing it. It is the body registering in its own blunt and insistent language that it has lost its reason to move. There is a psychological logic to this that is worth understanding, because understanding it tends to reduce the secondary suffering, the shame and self-recrimination that pile on top of the primary condition and make it considerably worse. Motivation and the neurological level is substantially mediated by dopamine. Not the dopamine of pleasure as it is popularly misunderstood, but the dopamine of anticipation, of directed wanting, of moving towards something that the brain has flagged as worth pursuing. Purpose, it turns out, is one of the primary engines of that anticipatory signal. When it is present, the brain generates a kind of low-level forward momentum, a background hum orientation that makes action feel, if not always easy, at least natural. When it is absent, that signal degrades. The result is not simply that you feel sad. It is that the neurological machinery of motivation begins to run at reduced capacity, and actions that were once automatic begin to require conscious, effortful override. You are not being weak. You are running a system that is missing one of its primary inputs. What this means practically is that the relationship between the purpose and the body runs in both directions. The loss of purpose produces physical stillness, yes, but physical stillness also deepens the loss of purpose. The two reinforce each other in a loop that can become over time genuinely difficult to interrupt from the inside. This is worth knowing not because it offers an easy exit. The advice to simply go for a walk, however well-intentioned, can feel almost offensive when you are in the depths of it, but because it tells us something important about where the leverage points are. The mind and the body are not separate departments. What you do with one always, in some measure, speaks to the other. There is a small but telling experiment that you can run on yourself, and I invite you to try it honestly. Think back to a period in your life when you were deeply absorbed in something that mattered to you, a project, a relationship, a pursuit of some kind that had genuine stakes. Now, try to recall how time felt during that period. My guess is that it felt in some articulate way structured, that the days had shape, that weeks cohered in a legible sequence, that you had some felt sense of moving through time rather than simply being moved by it. Now, compare that to a period of purposelessness if you ever had one. What happens to time there is, I think, one of the least discussed but most destabilizing aspects to the whole experience. It slows down significantly. It becomes shapeless. There is a fairly well-established relationship in psychology between goal-directed activity and what researchers call temporal structure, the subjective sense that time is organized, that the present moment exists in a meaningful relation to both a path that led here and a future worth moving toward. Purpose in this framework functions almost like a skeleton for time. It gives each moment a position within a larger sequence, a reason to be, where it is a story rather than a simply point floating free. When purpose dissolves, the skeleton goes with it, and what remains is a kind of temporal shapelessness that is deeply disorienting in ways that are difficult to convey to someone who hasn't experienced it. The days begin to blur. Weeks pass and leave almost no impression. You look back at a month and you find it nearly impossible to account for, not because nothing happened, but because nothing that happened felt like it was going anywhere. And time without direction has a way of leaving very little residue. So you go out and you wonder, when did summer came? The past is affected too, and one of the things that purpose does, quietly and continuously, is lend retrospective continuity to a life you have already lived. Your history looks like a path when you are walking it purposefully. The choices connect, the detours make sense, even the failures can be read as formative. But when purpose collapses in the present, it has a way of reaching backward and destabilizing the past as well. The years of work that felt like investment begin to look like mere expenditure. The sacrifices that seemed purposeful reappear as simply losses. I describe this as a kind of retrospective vertigo. The sensation of looking back down a road you thought you had walked with intention and realizing you can no longer quite make out why you took it. What you are left with is a kind of imprisonment in the present, but a present that has been hollowed out by the loss of both its past continuity and its future orientation. This is not the mindful, luminous present that the meditation teachers describe. It is its shadow twin, a present that feels less like an arrival than a waiting room, one whose purpose you have forgotten and whose exit you cannot locate. Heidegger, characteristically difficult but occasionally worth the effort, described authentic existence as a condition of being toward something, a fundamental orientation that gives the present its weight and significance. Purposelessness, by this reading, is not simply an emotional state. It is a distortion of the basic temporal structure through which human beings experience being alive. I find it striking that so many people who have been through serious episodes of purposelessness reach independently for the same metaphor. They describe feeling unstuck in time, not in the fanciful science fiction sense, but in the visceral sense of having lost a thread that connects a day to the next, that makes a life feel like a life rather than a series of disparate events that happen to feature the same person. There is something that happens to the people around you when you lose your purpose, and it is rarely talked about with any honesty. Perhaps because it implicates everyone in ways that are uncomfortable. The people who love you can feel the absence. They may not have the vocabulary for it. They will not say you seem purposeless, but they will say that you seem distant or flat, or that you haven't quite been yourself lately. Why the face? Are you okay? What is wrong with you? And they are right, in the sense that the self in you was in large part constituted by the directed energy that has since gone quiet. What they are detecting is not a mood, it is a structural change in who you are presenting to the world and to them. This creates a particular kind of relational friction that compounds the original problem. The person in the grip of purposelessness often withdraws, not out of hostility or indifference, but because genuine connection requires a degree of presence that is difficult to summon when your interior life has gone to ground. You show up physically, but not fully, and the people who know you well enough to notice the gap between the two tend to experience that gap as something directed at them, as a withdrawal of investment in the relationship specifically, rather than a global dimming of the engagement with everything. Misreadings accumulate. The person who is already struggling begins to feel on top of everything else the additional weight of other people's hurt or confusion, and the social world that might otherwise offer some ballast becomes instead another source of demand. Then there is the subtler and more insidious pattern, which is the one where other people become, consciously or not, a substitute for purpose itself. I have seen this operate in enough people, and if I am honest, in myself at certain points, that I think it deserves to be named directly. When the internal sense of direction collapses, relationships can begin to function as a kind of borrowed meaning. The other person becomes the project, the container for all the purposive energy that has nowhere else to go. This looks from the outside like devotion. It can feel from the inside like love. But it is worth examining carefully because it places a weight on another person that no relationship is really designed to bear, and intends in time to produce exactly the dynamic it has unconsciously tried to avoid. The other person, feeling the pressure of being someone else's entire reason of existing, begins to pull away, and the purposeless person experiences that withdrawal as confirmation of their worst suspicions about their own inadequacy. Frankl observed from circumstances considerably more extreme than most of us will ever face that love can be a powerful source of meaning. But he was careful, I think, to distinguish between love as an orientation toward another person and love as a refuge from the self. The first can sustain you. The second tends to hollow out both people involved. A relationship entered from a place of genuine fullness has a different quality than one entered from the need to fill a void. And most people can feel the difference, even when they cannot name it. There is a kind of emotional dependency that wears the costume of intimacy, but it is functionally closer to what psychologists call anxious attachment. A clinging born not from abundance but from scarcity, from the terror of being left alone with a self that no longer feels coherent. None of this is a moral failing. It is the predictable behavior of a person trying to survive an internal condition using the tools that are available to them. But it is worth seeing clearly because the relationship that tends to weather a purposeless episode are not the ones that the other person successfully fills the gap. They are the ones where the other person refuses to, gently, caringly, but firmly, and in doing so, declines to participate in an arrangement that would ultimately damage both of them. The few people who have genuinely helped me through difficult periods were not the ones who made themselves indispensable. They were the ones who remained present without becoming a crutch, who offered company without offering to replace the thing I actually needed to find. Here is a paradox that sits at the center of everything I have been discussing, and I want to approach it carefully because it is easy to misunderstand. The most natural response to losing purpose is to go look for it, to treat its absence as a problem that can be solved through sufficient effort, research, and introspection. In the same way you might solve the problem of losing your keys. You retrace your steps, you examine your options, you read the books, you take the assessments, consult the frameworks. You ask yourself with increasing urgency, what are you passionate about? What would you do if money were no issue? What you wanted to be before the world told you what to be. And if the purpose does not promptly materialize, you search harder and more systematically with greater desperation. What tends to happen next is the thing nobody warns you about. The searching itself becomes the problem. There is a concept in psychology called ironic process theory, demonstrated by Daniel Wagner, which holds that deliberate attempt to suppress or locate a particular mental state tends to produce the opposite of the intended effect. The harder you try not to think about something, the more insistently it will occupy your attention. The application to purpose seeking is not exact, but it is suggestive. When finding purpose becomes the consuming project of your life, You have effectively installed purposelessness at the center of your existence, and you are organizing everything around it. The search becomes a kind of hall of mirrors. Every reflection shows you the same image of a person looking for something, and the looking begins to feel indistinguishable from the thing itself. I have been searching for purpose for the better part of a decade, and the search has become, in a very real sense, my purpose, and one that I may be unconsciously invested in never quite completing, because completion would require me to stop searching, and I may have forgotten how to be a person who isn't. The self-help industry has predictably made this worse. The market for purpose finding is enormous and growing, which means there is a considerable financial incentive to keep people in a state of productive seeking rather than arrival. Every book, course, workshop, and retreat that promises to help you find your purpose has a structural interest in the problem remaining sufficiently complex and elusive to justify its own existence. I don't say this to be entirely cynical. Some of this material is genuinely useful, and I would be dishonest to dismiss it wholesale. But it is worth being clear-eyed about the incentive structure and about the degree to which the relentless commodification of the purpose search may be actively deepening the condition it claims to address. What the search also tends to produce at the more intimate level is a tendency for pointless rumination, the mental equivalent of pacing, the same questions circled endlessly without ever arriving anywhere meaningful. What am I for? What do I actually want? What would make this feel meaningful? These are not bad questions, but asked in a state of acute purposelessness, without the grounding that genuine engagement with life tends to provide, they have a way to become self-consuming rather than generative. The introspection looks back on itself. You excavate the same ground repeatedly and find the same absence, and each unsuccessful excavation suddenly reinforces the condition that the absence is permanent, that there is simply nothing there to find. Camus, again, is instructive here, because his response to the absurd was emphatically not to search harder for a resolution to it. It was to act, to engage with life directly, fully, without the precondition of first achieving philosophical clarity about its meaning. There is something almost antithetical to the modern sensibility in this prescription, because we have been so thoroughly trained to believe that understanding must precede action, that you should know what you are doing and why before committing to doing it. But the evidence from people who have actually gone through purposeless periods suggests the opposite sequence is often more true. Purpose tends to emerge from engagement rather than preceding it. You do not think your way back to purpose, you act your way back, tentatively and without guarantee, and the meaning accretes around the doing rather than the other way around. This does not mean that the search is worthless or that reflection has no role. It means that the reflection, untethered from action, tends to become its own form of avoidance, a way of feeling like you are addressing the problem while remaining safely insulated from the risk of actually living. The person who is endlessly preparing to find their purpose is not yet ready to confront the more frightening possibility, which is that purpose is not a destination you arrive at, but a quality of attention you bring to where you already are. None of this is an argument against self-awareness. Sometimes I do wish I would be a poor ignorant whose only concerns are what to eat and how many likes he gets on Facebook, who has no existential questions and doesn't even know what to ask of himself. But then I really consider that alternative, and I'd rather suffer the loneliness of mind and the purposelessness that comes with it. It is an argument for understanding its limits, for recognizing that introspection without direction becomes, over time, a loop rather than a path, and that the examine life, for all its Socratic prestige, still requires something outside of the examination to be worth examining in the first place. There is a thought experiment that has been circulating in various forms through philosophy, psychology, and the quieter corners of late-night personal crises. And it goes something like this. Imagine you have been given a terminal diagnosis, a fixed and not too distant horizon. Now, ask yourself what changes. Not in the practical sense, the arrangements, the conversations, the logistics of endings, but in the felt sense. What suddenly matters that didn't before? What falls away as obviously irrelevant that had moments earlier seemed pressing? What do you find yourself reaching toward, and what do you find you can set down without grief? I assure you, this is not a morbid exercise. It is, I would argue, one of the most clarifying lenses available to a person grappling with the question of purpose, precisely because mortality has a way of burning off the accumulated sediment of obligation, habit, and social performance, and leaving something closer to the bare truth of what you actually value. The Stoics understood this. Memento mori. Remember that you will die, was not, for Marcus Aurelius or Seneca, a counsel of despair. It was a tool for attention, for a way of restoring for the present moment the weight it tends to lose when we operate under the assumption that time is essentially unlimited. The person who lives as though they will never die tends paradoxically to live with considerably less urgency than what their life is actually for. Death, held at arm's length, produces the very shapelessness we discussed earlier, the sense that there is always more time, that the important questions can be deferred, that purpose is something to be sorted out later when conditions are more favorable. Conditions are never more favorable. Later has a way of becoming now without warning. But I want to be honest about the other side of this, because the relationship between confronting mortality and restoring purpose is not as redemptive as the self-help tradition tends to suggest. For some people, the genuine confrontation with death, not as a thought experiment, but as a lived reality through illness or loss, or the kind of existential crisis that strips away the comfortable insulation of ordinary life, does not restore purpose. It dissolves it further. If the function of purpose was always at some level to justify the project of being alive, to make the fact of existence feel earned rather than merely given, then staring directly at mortality can undermine that function rather than reinforce it. Why build anything, the thought goes, when the building will not outlast the builder by any meaningful margin? Why care when caring is itself a temporary condition of a temporary creature? This is not nihilism as a philosophical position, it is nihilism as a visceral response to the sudden apprehension of scale. The universe on one side, the human life on the other, and the vertiginous sense of disproportion between them. Tolstoy went through exactly this and documented it with an unflinching lucidity that I find almost unbearable to read in the wrong mood. In his Confessions, he describes arriving at the height of his fame and success, celebrated, wealthy, admired, and finding himself unable to cross a room without being ambushed by the question of why he should bother. Not in an abstract way, in the concrete, daily, physical way of a man who has looked at his own mortality clearly enough that all the usual analgesics has stopped working. He hid the rope in his study because he didn't trust himself near it. This from a man who had, by any external measure, more purpose than almost anyone alive. The point is not that success is meaningless. The point is that mortality, genuinely confronted rather than merely acknowledged, can temporarily vaporize the structure through which purpose was previously experienced. And the person left standing in that vaporized landscape is not in a position to simply decide to feel differently. What tends to happen next in the accounts of people who have passed through this particular fire and come out on the other side is something that resists easy summary. It is not in most cases that they found a new and better purpose to replace the old one. It is more that the relationship to purpose itself underwent a transformation. That the desperate, crouching quality of the pre-crisis search gave way to something quieter and more sustainable. A kind of orientation that did not require constant maintenance or external ratification. The philosopher Irvin Yalom, who has spent decades sitting with patients that were dying and writing about what that proximity to death produces in people, describes a phenomenon he calls the awakening experience, the paradoxical vitality that can follow a genuine confrontation with mortality, in which the previously unnoticed texture of ordinary life suddenly becomes almost unbearably vivid. The cup of coffee, the quality of light in the afternoon, the specific weight of another person's hand. None of these things constitute a purpose in any grand sense, but they constitute perhaps the substrate from which purpose, a more honest and less performative kind than the one that was lost, can eventually grow. The question of whether death as a mirror shows you what your life is worth or reveals that it was never worth anything in particular is one that I cannot answer for you. And I would be lying if I would claim that it has a settled answer for me. What I can say is that the people who seem to have come to the confrontation most intact are not the ones that looked away, and not the ones who stared so long that they went blind, but the ones who learned to hold the gaze steadily without flinching and without demanding that what they saw resolves itself into something comfortable. That capacity to hold the gaze, to sit with the void, to refuse both the false comfort of easy answers and the paralysis of none is, I think, the closest thing to a genuine foundation for what comes next, which is the question I have been circling since the beginning, and which I can no longer defer. I want to do something that may feel briefly like an act of cruelty. I want to zoom out, not metaphorically, not in the loose way that people mean when they say look at the big picture, but genuinely, astronomically, in the way that the actual scale of things demand if we are being honest about it. You are a biological organism on a mid-sized planet orbiting an unremarkable star in the outer arm of one galaxy among an estimated 2 trillion just in the observable universe. The Earth has existed for about 4.5 billion years, and modern humans have been here for perhaps 300,000 of those years. Recorded civilization, the entire substrate from which every philosophy, every artwork, every act of meaning-making we have discussed in this conversation accounts for roughly 6,000 years. Which is to say, if the history of the planet were compressed into a single calendar year, human civilization would occupy approximately the last 90 seconds of December 31st, and the universe itself is expected to continue for timescales so vast they resist ordinary comprehension. Not billions of years, but trillions, and then quadrillions more, until the last stars exhaust their fuel and go dark. I raise this not because I think it's settling anything, but because there is a particular cultural habit, especially pronounced in certain transatlantic contexts, that I think deserves honest examination. It is the habit of legacy. The idea that what rescues a life from meaninglessness is the mark it leaves, the work that outlasts the worker, the name that echoes forward through time, the contribution that changes things in some permanent and measurable way. We are told in various registers that the goal is to build something that matters, to leave the world different than we found it, to be remembered. And I understand the appeal of this. It is a genuinely human response to the terror of impermanence. And it has produced some of the most extraordinary things our species has ever made. But let us be precise about the arithmetic. Einstein died in 1955. His work restructured our understanding of space, time, and the fundamental nature of physical reality. Arguably, the most consequential scientific contribution of the 20th century. In 10,000 years, assuming there are still beings capable of the concept, his name may persist in some form. In 100,000 years, this becomes considerably less certain. And in 1,000,000 years, the probability of any specific human name or idea surviving, being in a recognizable form, approaches something very close to zero. In 1,000,000,000 years, the planet itself will be uninhabitable, scorched by a sun in the early stages of its expansion into a red giant. The work, the name, the legacy, all of it reclaimed by the indifferent arithmetic of stellar evolution. And this is not a pessimistic projection, it's just simply what physics says. The legacy argument for purpose, taken seriously against this backdrop, begins to look like what it was perhaps always, a local solution to local anxiety, constructed at a scale of human lifetimes and human civilizations, and quietly assuming that scale is the relevant one. It is not obviously wrong to find meaning in contribution, in lasting impact, in the work that outlives you. But it is worth being clear that this is a chosen frame, a deliberate decision to care about a particular window of time and not the ones that precede or follow it. The universe did not endorse this choice. It is simply indifferent to it. In the same way, it is indifferent to everything else. Now, there are two responses to this observation, and they lead in opposite directions. The first is the response Camus already gestured toward, that the cosmic indifference does not diminish the human scale, that the fact that nothing lasts forever does not mean that nothing matters now, that the candle is not less warm for being temporary. This is a coherent and I think largely defensible position. The second response is harder and less comfortable, and it is the one that Schopenhauer and Choran were both circling from different angles. That the cosmic view, genuinely internalized rather than merely acknowledged, has a way of making the local constellations feel faintly absurd. Not wrong exactly, but observed in a technical sense. Insufficient to the scale of the question that are being asked to answer. I do not think the cosmic perspective destroys the case for purpose, but I do think it changes it. Strips away the parts that were always leaning on legacy, on permanence, on the idea that mattering to the future is what makes a life worth living. What remains, once those props are removed, is something smaller and more honest. The question of whether this, the present, the fleeting moment, is enough, whether purpose can be grounded not in what endures, but in what is happening right now, in this body, in this brief window between two darknesses that neither know nor care about what occurs between them. That is, I think, the most stripped-down version of the question that this entire talk has been asking. And it does not have a clean answer. But I find that I prefer it to the alternatives, because at least it is asking about something real. Sometimes I hear often enough a response to everything I have been discussing that I want to address directly, because ignoring it would be a kind of evasion. It comes from a particular kind of person, often thoughtful, often well-read, occasionally slightly too pleased with themselves, and it goes something like this. The whole problem you are describing is a problem of desire. The suffering of the purposelessness is not caused by the absence of purpose. It is caused by the wanting of purpose. And the solution, therefore, is not to find one, but to stop requiring one. To be, as certain Buddhists and Stoics have suggested, simply content with what it is, without the restless imposition of meaning into a reality that never asked for it. I want to be careful here, because there is something genuinely valuable in this position, and I do not want to dismiss it cheaply. The diagnosis has real force. A great deal of human suffering is indeed generated not by circumstances, but by the gap between circumstances and expectations, and the expectations that life ought to feel purposeful is no exception. If you could genuinely release that expectation, not suppress it, not perform its absence, but actually dissolve it, you would, almost by definition, stop suffering from its non-fulfillment. The Stoics were not naive about this. The Buddhist concept of non-attachment is not an invitation to passivity, but a sophisticated and seriously meant philosophical position that has sustained billions of people across millennia, and I'm not in the business of dismissing it. But I want to press on the gap between the position as it is philosophically articulated and the position as it is actually lived, because I think that the gap is considerably wider than its proponents tend to acknowledge. The person who has genuinely achieved non-attachment to purpose, who moves through the world with full engagement and no clinging, present to each moment without the anxious project of making it cohere into something, is a real possibility. It is also, in my experience, an extraordinarily rare one. What I more commonly encounter when someone tells me they have made peace with purposelessness is one of the three things that wear its costume without quite being it. The first is what I would call perform equanimity, the intellectual adaptation of a framework that sounds like liberation, but is functioning beneath the surface as a more sophisticated form of avoidance. It is easier in certain temperaments to construct a philosophical justification for not wanting than to confront the more vulnerable question of what you actually want and why are you afraid of it. Nietzsche characteristically had a word for it. He called it passive nihilism, and he was not flattering about it. The person who has genuinely relinquished the need for purpose radiates a particular quality of ease and presence. The person who has intellectually convinced themselves they have done so often radiates something rather more tense. The second is genuine exhaustion mistaken for acceptance. The person who has been purposeless for long enough, who has searched and failed and searched again and arrived at nothing, sometimes reaches a point of what feels like peace, but is functionally closer to the numbness I described in the first section, the wanting goes quiet, not because it has been transcended, but because it has been depleted. This is not criticism. These are recognizable and entirely human responses to prolonged struggle. But it is worth distinguishing from the real thing because the remedies are different. The third is the most interesting case, at least to me, and the one I am least certain about. The person who genuinely is, by some combination of temperament and circumstance and perhaps genuine philosophical work, not particularly oriented toward purpose in the way this talk has been assuming everyone is, there are people for whom the framework of purpose, the directional striving, narrative-driven engagement with life, simply does not map accurately onto their experience, and for whom this is not a deficit, but a different mode of being. I want to hold open the possibility that this is real, because I think the alternative, insisting that everyone must need purpose, that the absence of it, of this pursuit, is always a symptom of something, is its own form of imperialism. Not everyone's inner life is organized around the questions this monologue has been asking. And for those people, the most honest thing I can say is, if it is genuinely working, if the is real and not performed, then perhaps this monologue has not been quite addressed to you. But if there is any flicker of recognition in what has been said here, any small persistent discomfort that the philosophy of non-attachment has not quite managed to extinguish, then it probably was. I want to be careful here at the end not to betray everything that came before it. I have spent a considerable amount of time looking honestly at purposelessness, its anatomy, its philosophical dimensions, its physical and relational and creative consequences, and it would be a particular kind of dishonesty to now produce a tidy list of remedies that implicitly suggest that the whole thing was always solvable, that the void was merely a puzzle awaiting the correct sequence of steps. It was not, and I don't think you came here for that. So let me try instead to say something true, even when true means incomplete. The first thing worth saying is that there is no way through that does not go through. This sounds like the kind of gnomic utterance that belongs on a motivational poster, so let me be more specific. Every account I have encountered of a genuine recovery from a serious collapse of purpose, and I mean recovery in the sense of arriving at something real and sustainable, not merely the performance of having recovered, involves at some point a period of sitting with the absence. This runs counter to every instinct the purposeless person has, and counter to most of the advice that they will receive, which tends toward the urgently prescriptive: exercise, meditate, volunteer, set small goals, find communities. None of these things are wrong exactly, but deployed as an escape from the void rather than an engagement with it, they become sophisticated avoidance, a way of staying busy enough that the deeper question never quite gets the silence it needs to be heard properly. The void is not, I want to suggest, simply an absence to be filled. It is, at least in part, a signal. An insistent communication from some part of yourself that the previous arrangement is not working and that patching it with new activities is not the same as understanding what failed and why. This does not mean passivity. It does not mean lying in a dark room waiting for revelation. What it means, I think, is developing the capacity to act without the prior guarantee of meaning. To engage with life tentatively, experimentally, without demanding that each engagement immediately justifies itself as purposeful. The writer who cannot write because nothing feels worth writing should, at some point, write anyway. Not because the work would necessarily be good or because the act would instantly restore the lost sense of direction, but because the alternative is a silence that compounds itself. The person who has withdrawn from relationships because genuine connection feels impossible in their current state should, at some point, reach out anyway, imperfectly, without the fullness they wish they had to offer, trusting that presence, even reduced, is better than the clean absence of waiting until you feel ready. Purpose, as I said at the very beginning of this monologue, tends to emerge from engagement rather than preceding it. That observation is easy to make and genuinely hard to act on when you are inside the condition it describes. But it is, as far as I can tell, one of the more reliable things we know. The second thing worth saying is that the purpose you rebuild, if you rebuild it, will probably not look like the one you lost. And this is not a consolation prize. It may, in fact, be the most valuable thing the whole experience produces. The purpose that collapses in a crisis tends, on examination, to have been somewhat borrowed, assembled from cultural expectations, parental projections, the accumulated momentum of choices made before you were fully formed, enough to make them consciously. The crisis strips that away, which is agonizing, but it also creates the conditions for something more genuinely yours to emerge, something chosen in Sartre's sense, rather than simply inherited. The people I find most compelling, most alive in the specific way that purposeful people are alive, are almost never the ones who found their purpose early and never lost it. They are the ones who lost it badly, stayed with the loss long enough to understand it, and built something on the other side that they could actually stand behind. The third thing, I think it is the most important and most consistently underemphasized, is that you cannot do this alone. Not because you are weak, but because the self that lost purpose is not a reliable guide to the territory of its own recovery. I know that will be people that will say that you must first become comfortable with being alone, but this is not about that. And it is a firm belief of mine that this cannot be done alone. It is too close, too compromised by the condition itself, too prone to the rumination dangers and avoidance strategies that I have already talked about. Other people are not a substitute for purpose, as I discussed, but they are often the medium through which it returns. Through genuine conversation, through being witness in a struggle rather than performing competence over it. Through the specific kind of contact that reminds you at the level of felt experience rather than intellectual understanding that you are not sealed inside yourself. Frankl did not find meaning alone in the camps. He found it in the image of his wife's face, in the connection to something and someone beyond himself, in the stubborn human insistence on relation, even in conditions specifically designed to make relation impossible. I am aware that none of this constitutes a prescription. I am aware that someone in the depths of the purposeless episode may listen to all this and feel quite reasonably that it is easier to articulate than to embody. That the distance between understanding these things and actually living them is not a short one. I know that distance. I am not talking from the comfortable vantage point of someone who has fully resolved the questions this monologue has been asking. Quite the contrary, I am in the very center of the eye of the hurricane, not at the beginning, paralyzed by the void, and not at some imagined end where everything coheres, but somewhere in the ongoing, imperfect, occasionally luminous process of trying to live with intention inside a condition that does not always cooperate. An observation is all I can honestly offer, because the alternative, the reassurance, the tidy resolution, the image of the caterpillar dissolving itself into a butterfly would cost you something you cannot afford to spend. Your own clear-eyed assessment of where you actually are. Beware the comfort of being right.